Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series for this semester, Spring 2025. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. I'm the curator of this series, which makes me your host as we undertake our latest set of author conversations. In a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, biologist and Emory professor Jaap de Roode, and his brand new book, Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. But first, let me tell you about this series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, and health's intersection with society. This series of conversations is sponsored by the Emory Center for the Study of Human Health, along with an array of fantastic co-sponsors. This spring, those have been the Georgia Center for the Book, a local affiliate of the Library of Congress that stages very frequent public conversations with authors, illustrators, poets, and others to bring the news of new books to the public. Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement, which creates opportunities for faculty, staff, and students to share ideas with local and global audiences, and the center's new Ideas Festival Emory, which launched last September on Emory's Oxford campus and will return this coming October with an amazing lineup of speakers that are just now being announced. And in March this year, we had a special co-sponsorship from the amazing Atlanta Science Festival, which every year sponsors 2 weeks of events that bring science to the public. Let me tell you who else has been appearing in this series, which is live streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and archived all 5 years of interviews on YouTube. In January, we heard from Johns Hopkins Associate Professor Caitlin Rivers, PhD, with Crisis Averted: The Hidden Science of Fighting Outbreaks from Viking. In February, I talked to Dr. Adam Ratner, professor of pediatrics and microbiology at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine, about his timely new book, Booster Shots: The Urgent Lesson of Measles and the Uncertain Future of Children's Health. And in March, I spoke to award-winning science writer Carl Zimmer about his latest 15th book, Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe. One final note before we get started with our guest. This is a live event. You can interact with us, and we encourage you to do that. If you want to ask a question, please comment on any of the platforms where you are watching us, and our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure that we see what you've said. Do note that I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this 60-minute live stream, but you can put your questions into the boxes at any time. Now let's turn to our book and guest. Jaap de Roode is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University, where he leads the de Roode Lab and teaches courses on biology, evolution, and infectious diseases. He's also the director of the Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program, which trains graduate students in the study and control of infectious disease. He's also a prominent science communicator and a TED speaker. And for more than a decade, he's been studying the interactions between animals and insects and the parasites that latch onto them and live within them. Work that in 2010 led to the provocative headline, "Do monarch butterflies use drugs?" And tonight he'll tell us how that work led 15 years later to this, his first book. Jaap, welcome to this series.
Thank you so much. It's great being here.
So I think before we get any further, don't you have some additional guests to introduce us to?
They're kind of resting right now, but this here is Cooper. He's a little
Cooper. Very
miniature
cute.
multi-poo, and then down here I've got Tucky. Tucky is a mini poodle. Tucky is actually in my book. And both of them have done some amazing stuff in terms of medication that we'll probably talk about.
We're going to talk about that. But I think we need to talk first about you, who you are, and especially how you came to write this book. Introduce us to yourself.
Yeah, so I'm from the Netherlands, and I studied biology in the Netherlands at Wageningen University. And I remember the day that I became interested in parasites. It was actually my 21st birthday. And my professor at the time in the lab where I did my research, he organized a symposium. At that symposium was my then future PhD advisor giving an amazing talk about malaria parasites competing with each other in the bloodstream of a host, competing for red blood cells. And that was the moment that I fell in love with parasites. I then did a PhD on malaria with him at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And then I kind of became frustrated with working with malaria in laboratory mice. And I really wanted to work on something that was more natural and an animal that had interesting parasites that I could study in the lab as well as in the field. And then I discovered that monarch butterflies have this amazing parasite. I love parasites. So when I say amazing, I mean, interesting from the parasite's point of view. It's not so nice for the monarch because they infect them, they can kill them, they reduce their ability to fly. But that's how I got into monarchs and their parasites. And from there, really started to think about how can animals use medication.
I remember reading in your bio that you had an interesting relationship with animals growing up. Your mother worked in a zoo, is that right? But you yourself didn't have pets because you had allergies, and so your relationship with animals was somewhat distant. And obviously that's changed.
Yeah, no, that's right. I had a goldfish, and that was the closest I got to an animal in our house. My sister and I, we both had allergies, so we never had cats or dogs. And so now I do two hypoallergenic cute dogs, and it's been really great being so close. But you're right, I always had an interest in animals. My mom was a tour guide in the zoo in Rotterdam. We lived close to there, so I went with her a lot, got to learn a lot about the animals and how they were cared for. And I read a lot about animals. But yeah, having these guys, in my notes, like I just showed, was something that I could never have dreamt of at that time.
So why monarchs? You said that their parasites are interesting, but it seems enviable to me to be able to work on an animal that's intriguing and beautiful. And those of us who have heard of monarchs, who plant milkweed in our yards to help monarchs know about their amazing migration journey.
Absolutely, and that's the reason most people know about monarch butterflies. And monarchs are not just amazing for the migration they undertake every year. So we have monarchs here in the United States and Canada. At the end of the summer, when the milkweeds that they use as caterpillars, when they die, they fly to central Mexico, and that's like thousands of miles for some of them. They go to central Mexico to a few very small patches of forest where they then overwinter until February or March, and then they mate and they start flying back north, which is really, really incredible. And in addition, they're also very pretty. They're orange and they have black and white. They're kind of a majestic monarch. That's where the name actually comes from. When the Dutch colonists first came to the Americas and saw this majestic, large orange butterfly, they called it the monarch of the Netherlands. And so they're pretty, but you're absolutely right. I don't study them because they're pretty or because they undertake migration. I really got to them because they get sick. And, we often don't really think about it. Humans get sick, our pets get sick, we take them to the vet. But the idea that wildlife and especially wild insects get diseases is kind of alien to a lot of people. But that is really the reason that brought me to them. But then studying them, we now look at their migration. And of course, we greatly benefit from working on monarchs because it's so easy to talk about science when you work on a system that a lot of people know and that a lot of people love. So we go to festivals and we talk about our science. It's a really great way to get science closer to anyone, really.
So they're the charismatic megafauna of insects. That's something that people really care about.
Yeah.
So that paper, the story about which I spotted about do monarchs use drugs? It was a very clever headline. That was back in 2010. So you have been
Yeah,
working on this for quite a while. So tell us
yeah.
about that research first, and then we'll start talking more about this question of animals using medicine across many species.
Yeah, so when I first came to the United was back in 2005 to work on monarch parasites, I really kind of wanted to understand parasites. We define parasites as organisms that take advantage of a host. They take energy and resources. They do a lot of damage, but they don't give anything in return. And so just understanding how do parasites do that, what kind of growth do they have where they can get from one host to another without killing the host if, that is not beneficial to them. But because monarchs are specialist feeders on milkweeds, and we also knew that monarchs use the toxins in milkweeds to protect themselves from predators, and that's partly the reason why they actually advertise their toxicity with their orange, black, and white coloration, because they can deal with the toxins. If we eat milkweeds, we can actually die, especially some species are very young. And it was kind of logical when I was working on them and growing milkweed in the greenhouse. This was at the job. And really thought then, it's like, well, these chemicals work against predators. Maybe they work against parasites as well. And I started with some really simple rearing monarchs on different plants, different species of milkweed, and them have a lot of toxins, others don't. And we found that monarchs on the plants with more toxins, the more toxic plants, they also benefit. The monarchs benefit. They don't get as sick with the parasites. So that was really the start.
So we should probably dive right in to this idea of there being medicines in nature. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who are familiar with the origin of some human drugs, in the natural origin of some human drugs, Madagascar periwinkle, willow bark, and so forth. We'll talk about those later about human drugs. But when we talk about medicinal compounds in nature, what exactly are we talking about? What are those chemicals? What function do they serve?
Yes, so animals and of course humans are one animal. There's a lot of different compounds from nature. That's the same for animals. The same. A lot of those compounds are toxins that are produced by plants. It can also be toxins.
Well, I'm sorry to say that it looks like Jaap is frozen. So we're going to ask him to disconnect and reconnect and hope that he gets a better connection. So I'm going to vamp for a minute until he comes back. Let me tell you, all of those of you who are listening, I can see all of you who are in here. Thank you so much. That we've been doing this series for 5 years now. So that's 5 years of authors of new books on health and science and the science of health talking to us about everything that led to their books and the scientific achievements that are described and represented in them. And as a result, we have a 5-year archive that is available for you to watch on the YouTube channel of the Center for the Study of Human Health. And we're going to give you a link to that at the end of our chat tonight, because while we're on hiatus over the summer, I think those of you who have joined us recently would really enjoy those past interviews. And it looks like Jaap is back, so let's try again.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I don't have anyone else on the internet at my house. I'm here by myself. So.
Well, we're really glad that you're back, and let's hope that this is better. So what we were talking about was the presence of medicinal compounds in plants and the function that they serve for the plants before animals get around to exploiting them.
Yes. Yeah. So if you think about plants, and if you were to anthropomorphize, you could say that animals or plants don't want to be eaten, right? So, and plants are really beautiful food for a lot of different animals. There's a lot of herbivores that includes mammals, but it also includes a lot of different insects. And so, as a protection, plants have evolved a lot of different ways to put it. That can be thorns, it can be latex, but oftentimes it's very toxic chemicals. And these chemicals can be killing insects or make it hard for the insects or other animals to eat. And so basically, plants are full of these beautiful chemicals that have evolved to protect against herbivores, but also against pathogens like bacteria and viruses and fungi that infect the plants. And so what we're seeing is that humans and a lot of other animals can take advantage of those chemicals and use them for ailments of themselves.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting is the book is the way in which you sort of define the terms of your inquiry, whether something is actually medicinal, how it's medicinal, different ways that animals can exploit these chemical compounds. Talk a bit about that for a minute, because that's going to set the stage for all the examples I'm going to ask you about.
Yeah, so first off, you know, one of the things that I found really challenging when writing the book is defining what medicine is. And I quickly realized that everyone you talk to has a different definition of what medicine is. You can think of use of drugs, you can think of preventative care, you can think of surgery and things like that. So I kind of restricted the book to really thinking about the use of medicines or the use of drugs. And then when you think about the chemicals or other substances that animals use, they can basically use them in 4 different ways. And so we define 4 different ways of animal medication. One of them is prophylaxis. So this is the use of chemicals to prevent future infection. And humans do that too, right? So a lot of us, when we travel to places where there may be a high risk of malaria, we start taking tablets before we go on the off chance that we're going to have that malaria infection. So that's prophylaxis. Animals do that. There are monkeys, for example, living in areas with a lot of schistosome parasites that eat berries that are very toxic, more so than in areas where they don't face those parasites. Then there's therapeutic medication. So this is the kind of medication where you start using a drug because you are sick already. And, you know, we do that all the time. When we have an infection, we go to the doctor, maybe get some antibiotics to take care of it. That's therapy. And a lot of animals do that, including chimpanzees. Then there is body anointing. And so this is when you basically see an animal rubbing itself with a chemical that then actually prevents being bitten by ectoparasites such as mosquitoes or ticks or botflies. Lemurs and capuchins actually rub themselves with toxic millipedes, which then stop mosquitoes biting them, which is really exciting. And then the final method is fumigation. And so this is where you basically put a gas, you know, when you think about humans, when do you fumigate, maybe fill a house with gases to kill pests and really get rid of them, or we spray insecticides to get rid of mosquitoes, maybe indoors or outdoors. Some people in Atlanta do that. And so that is using chemicals to really repel basically parasites in your environment. And a lot of birds do this, but also bees and ants.
So I want to bring back this question of toxic compounds that we were talking about just a moment ago. There was an important point that I think you made in the book, that one of the things that defines whether something's being used medicinally is that under normal circumstances, an animal wouldn't eat it, right? Or use it, that it would otherwise be toxic for them, except in the particular case of it being used therapeutically or prophylactically.
That's right. And I think that's a really important hallmark of the use of medicines. Now, again, you know, what is a medicine and what is a toxin? It all comes down to the dose, right? And toxicology, the field of toxicology has known this for a long time. And, you know, we know that ourselves too. A little bit of caffeine in coffee can help you become alert. If you have too much and you were to inject it straight in your bloodstream, it can actually kill you, right? So, but generally speaking, yes, you see animals using medicinal substances, and in the absence of the infection, it is actually costly to do that. So, for example, chimpanzees that use very toxic plants avoid those plants when they don't need it because it's so bad for them. And it's the same for us, right? When we think about taking medication and you read that leaflet that comes with your medicines, and sometimes you think, why am I taking this? But there's all these side effects, right? But so usually you use it when you need it, but avoid it when you don't because of those side effects.
So you just said chimpanzees avoid. and I want to jump on that verb
Mhm.
because there that the amount of agency and intention expressed in that. Are we confident that animals know what they're doing when they do this?
It's such a great question, and it's almost, it almost raises the question what we mean by does an animal know something. And I always like to kind of bring it back to humans, because it's often implied in questions like this that we know what we're doing, but there's a lot of times we don't know what we're doing. And so, for example, when you feel sick, you have specific urges for food that you don't normally want to eat, or you really get repelled by some smells of food that you really loved yesterday, right? And so that's not because we know what we're doing, that's our bodies telling us what to do or what not to do. And so I think it's the same for a lot of other animals, that, animals don't need to know to say, okay, hey, I'm sick. I think I have worms. I know I need to find a plant that's going to help me. So they may not know it in that way, right? But what they can do is their body tells them, you don't feel good, and maybe get a preference now for something that really tastes bitter that you would otherwise avoid. But now it feels right. It feels good. It tastes good. So you're going to eat it. And once you feel better, you don't like the taste anymore. So I think that is true for a lot of cases. And that can be as true for goats, sheep, chimpanzees, humans, as well as butterflies and ants. And, but beyond that, there is animals that can learn through association. When they feel bad, they eat something, they recover, they now associate that particular compound or that particular plant with feeling better. Next time they feel sick, they go and look for it specifically. And then animals can learn from each other too. And we see that in chimpanzees, but also in sheep, where they're much more likely to develop some of these medicinal behaviors when they are surrounded by other animals that use it. But I don't know. I don't think there's many cases where animals really, consciously know exactly what is going on and therefore go and look for something. So there is agency, but maybe not in the way that we would think of it. I'm sick, I'm going to the doctor, then I'm going to the pharmacy.
Mm. I usually save audience questions till the second half of the hour. This is a good time to remind people that you can put your questions in the box. We'd love to
Mhm.
see them. But here's one from someone who's been listening,
Yeah.
wanting to know about the difference, if there is a difference between animals consuming something for nutritional reasons and consuming something for therapeutic reasons. Is there a difference, and can they tell?
It is such a great question, and something that is debated. So scientists, studying animals using medicine actually disagree on this. I would say that there are clear examples where animals use nutrition as a medicine, or they increase the intake of particular nutrients that they were already using. And we see this, for example, in caterpillars. You see it in sheep as well, where they may take in more protein relative to carbohydrates, for example, and that helps them with their immune system. So, is that a form of medicine? Some people would say yes. Other people would say no, it has to be something toxic. But at the end of the day, the animal gets better, right? It's healing itself. So, I would say it's a form of medicine. But this is where, those definitions of what is medicine are very difficult to answer. For example, in traditional Chinese medicine, nutrition is a really important aspect of it. Drinking green tea, is that medicine or is that nutrition? I mean, it's a very blurry line. But at the end of the day, it heals. So for me, it's a form of medication.
So I was really interested to read fairly early on in the book. You talk actually about one of the first papers that you wrote about this phenomenon. Maybe it was that one about bugs using drugs, and that there was a great deal of hostility at the time among researchers to this idea that
Yeah.
animals were doing this and also were doing it consciously, to the point that
Mhm.
I think you had to take something out of the paper to satisfy reviewers.
Yes. And this is how it works when you write science papers. They go for peer review. So people that are specialists in the field read it and give comments and really judge it whether it's scientifically sound before it gets published, which is a great system. But we had, so the first paper where we described that when you rear monarch butterflies on more toxic milkweed, that they are healthier, they become less infected, and when they do become infected, they suffer less from the disease than when they're reared on a plant that is less toxic. So that was a very clear result. And then in the discussion of that paper, we speculated or hypothesized really that maybe the monarch butterflies could use this either as caterpillars choosing between different foods, or even as the mothers when they lay eggs to preferentially lay them on the plants that will make their offspring less sick. And one of the reviewers said there's just no way that a butterfly could do that. So, and then the editor agreed, and we had to remove that from the discussion. And so that was in the 2000s. That was around 2010. And that same kind of resistance occurred earlier in the 1980s when people discovered chimpanzees can use medicine. Because even then people said, there's no way that chimpanzees can do this. There's no way animals are clever enough to do this. And so it took some time for people to buy that chimpanzees can do it. That was a little bit easier to swallow, right? Because chimpanzees are very similar to us in many ways, got big brains, and we already knew they could do some amazing things. And so then we had the same thing with insects. But once you show the data and it shows it's not just butterflies, it's ants and it's bees and it's fruit flies. A lot of insects are now clear that they can use medicine. And so that whole idea is gaining acceptance for sure.
It sounds as though there was a prejudice for sort of on behalf of bigger brains, feeling that that animals with what we'd recognize as like complicated cognition, we could allow for them doing this, but something that is the size of the tip of your ballpoint pen, we're not going to accept it from them.
That's right, and I think it really comes from this idea that one thing that I found really interesting in writing the book was really discovering that kind of resistance is a very Western scientific resistance approach, right? So because what I found in writing the book is that actually traditional healers and shamans all around the world have looked at animals for thousands of years because they know animals use medicine. They can learn from them. A lot of treatments that they use are based on what they copied from animals. And so for them, it's not surprising. But then I think that the Western scientific approach is so focused on this dualism that is really underlying our society and our major religions, where humans are different from nature. In some cases, we're above from nature, we're special. And I think that distinction has for a long time really shaped people's expectation that humans must have unique characteristics that make us different from other animals, right? For a while, it was tools. Humans are the only ones using tools. And then it was language, and then it was empathy, and then it was culture. And every time we come up with something that's uniquely human, we break it down when we do the science. And so it's the same, medicine is surely something. And you can define, a lot of people define medicine as the human activity to heal others or yourself. So if you say that, you make it specific. But when you look at the healing practices, other animals do it. But I think there's just so much resistance and such an urge in Western science for humans to be different. And we're not that different.
So the question of the knowledge of animal medication being present in traditional systems is a thread that I want to tug on in a minute. But first, I'm going to remind the folks watching us, I see all your numbers. Thank you very much for being here. If you want to ask a question of Jaap, please put it in the comments on any of the platforms where you're watching us. And as you heard just a moment ago, I will ask it of him. So Jaap, what are some of your favorite examples of animals and insects using medication? There are so many throughout the book of all species, all sizes. Maybe sort of take us through the taxonomy.
Yeah, I think every example is great, but I will say my favorite chapter of the book is chapter 5. And this is the chapter where I talk about birds using cigarette butts. And so this is a beautiful story, I think, for many reasons. Part of the reason is that this was really discovered by an undergraduate student who had just started out her scientific studies and joins a lab and is studying the effects of urbanization on birds and how they build nests. And so she was studying house finches and house sparrows, kind of predicting that all the trash that they encounter in the urban environment is going to be detrimental to their nests and to the chick survival in those nests. And in doing this study, she discovers that a lot of these nests have white, fluffy material. And she couldn't figure out what it was until it rained and she smelled smoke. And that is when she realized that the birds are collecting cigarette butts. So these are the filters, discarded filters of the cigarettes. The birds take them to the nest and they start picking them apart and putting the fibers in the lining of their nest. And the other thing is, like, her advisor just wouldn't believe her. And so she had to make the nest wet and say, look, smell this. This is smoke. This is cigarettes. And then he was sold on the idea. And then they found that when the birds had more cigarette butts in the nest, they had fewer ectoparasites, so things such as lice and ticks and mites that suck the blood of the chicks. But that could still be coincidental, right? It could be that the birds collect the cigarette butts for one reason, and it has the side effect of really reducing the parasites in the nest. So then, coming back to the idea of agency and intentionality that you brought up earlier, is the question, well, do the birds really collect these butts as a form of medication? So then they did this beautiful experiment where they had a number of nests and they took out the lining that the birds had made, replaced it with a lining that they made, and it took them 2 years really to develop that. And then they added live ticks, dead ticks or no ticks. So ticks are the blood-sucking things that we get when we go for a hike. And so the birds get them too. And what they found is that when they did that, the birds started collecting more cigarette butts only when there were live ticks in the nest. And then they also showed that by doing this, it made the chicks healthier, have higher fledgling success, and so they really benefited from it. But I thought it was just a beautiful example in terms of how the science was done, who discovered it, but also the ingenuity of these birds that live in cities. And, normally a lot of bird species collect all sorts of things, mostly plants, very strong smelling plants, and that could be the tobacco plants that have nicotine. But then when the birds are in an urban environment, when there is an easier way to get that nicotine, that's what they use. It's just amazing.
So someone has just asked a question that I also wanted to know when I read the book, which is, we're
Yes.
all so familiar with the idea that cigarettes are bad for us. And though those filters were developed, I don't know how many decades ago, to make them nominally less bad, or at least less unpleasant to smoke, they're there to trap all the bad stuff in cigarettes. So isn't that bad for the birds?
Yes. And so it goes right back to how we define a medicine. It has side effects. And that's what the researchers found as well, is that despite these benefits in terms of reducing parasitism, it also caused some anomalies in the blood cells of the chick. So it's not cost-free. There are costs associated with it. And so then the question is that the chemicals that are produced through the smoking process, or is it the nicotine itself? And because, again, nicotine is what they would normally use from the tobacco plants, but nicotine itself is also known to have side effects. So yeah, it goes right with that story that if you don't need it, avoid it. But if you need it, you have to accept those costs.
So we talked a moment ago about how these sort of behaviors are present in the tiniest beings, in ants and insects of other sorts. And now you've given, and butterflies, of course, and now you've given us an example of sort of a medium-sized species. But obviously, this goes to higher orders as well. Someone has already asked this, and I know it occurred to me, but what about dogs and cats and grass? I myself am a cat owner,
well,
but my cat
this
believes
is the
she's a
time
dog.
to bring this guy up again. So this is Cooper. So yes, so our dogs and our cats eat grass, and so I actually have a good anecdote for this guy here. Just last week, he came into my bedroom and he was walking around with some kind of rubber armband, and I didn't know what it was. So I pulled it out of his mouth, and it turned out it was a rubber armband that my son had gotten on Pi Day. So it was the number pi with lots of digits, lots of decimals, but it didn't have all of them, obviously. Well, it didn't have a lot. And I kept on wondering, where are the other decimals? And I asked my son, and he didn't know. And I took Cooper for a walk that morning. He ate grass, which he actually does quite regularly. And then when I came home from work in the afternoon, he threw up, and always on the rug, right? Never on the wooden floor. But there it was. There were the remaining decimals of the wristband. What is really interesting is that there are very, very few scientific studies on domestic dogs and cats that have looked at grass eating. And so that leaves it open to why exactly they do it. But when you look at wild carnivores, and whether it's wolves or coyotes, mountain lions, lynxes, people have found over decades worth of research that oftentimes what you find is that these animals eat grass, and then you either find vomit or you find feces that have the grass intact, and then it's also containing parasitic worms. And so, what carnivores most likely use grass for is to basically get rid of gut parasites from their stomachs and from their intestines. And they usually, when they eat grass, it's grass that's very rough, grass that even goats don't want to eat. And so it basically has little bristles, and it's almost like Velcro that can remove the parasites from the gut, but also really irritates the stomach and the gut so that they throw up or have diarrhea. And that really removes those parasites. So most likely when our pets do this, it is something that they inherited from their wild ancestors that was used against parasitic infections. But our domestic animals can use it to get rid of rubber armbands or pieces of Lego. I've seen that, and Barbie doll heads, things like that. So I always like to tell people, when you see your dog or your cat eat grass, provided it's clean grass, not covered in pesticides, but provided that you're pretty confident that it's healthy grass, let them do it, because they probably know better what they're doing than you do.
So there are no dogs in my household, sadly, but I am the parent of a Maine Coon cat, which are a very large, very fluffy species. And when I see her go outside and munch on the grass, I know that a hairball is coming. And as you say, always on the rug, never on the plain floor.
Yeah.
Which may be a way to a moment to ask. Is you referred to the evolutionary history of wolves and dogs and how this may be an inherited behavior, but is there can you make a determination of what's inherited or what's genetic and what's learned or behavioral? Where do these behaviors come from?
Yeah, so I like to give the example of woolly bear caterpillars. So these are the kind of caterpillars that a lot of people would call fuzzy wuzzies. And there are wonderful studies on these caterpillars. So these caterpillars get parasitoid flies. So these are parasitic flies that lay their eggs inside the caterpillar. The maggots come out of the eggs and they start eating up the caterpillar from the inside out. If you're a parasitologist like me, that's really amazing. If you're not, that's utterly gruesome, right? And it's very much like the scene in the first Alien movie, where that alien bursts out of the body of the person. But what helps these caterpillars against these flies is to eat high concentrations of specific alkaloids from their food. And what is really amazing, research has shown, so researchers have done this with tiny little electrodes. As it turns out, these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes the alkaloids that are bad for the flies. When they're infected with the flies, those receptors signal to the nerve cells that go to the brain to start firing at a higher rate. So that basically means that these alkaloids just taste way better when the caterpillar is infected. And therefore they eat more of it, and therefore they increase the dose that they take in, and that kills the flies. And so that is a really good example where the disease, in this case a parasitoid fly, changes the physiology of the caterpillar, and it responds by eating more of the alkaloids. And there's no learning involved in that. There is no social learning. They didn't learn it from anyone else. And also these caterpillars will not, they'll be pupae before they would know that they recovered, right? So they cannot even learn from that associative learning. So that's a behavior that is completely determined by the physiology and the genes in that organism. And so those kinds of behaviors, I think, are very common. But like I said earlier, there are definitely cases, and we see that a lot in sheep and goats. Wonderful research was done at Utah State University, where researchers looked at them and gave them, worms and then different foods, and they learn what is actually taking care of the worms and relieving the symptoms. So they start using that immediately next time they're infected. And then chimpanzees are a great example of social learning. So we just mentioned that grass eating by dogs and cats, and it's often this very rough grass. And so chimpanzees actually often swallow whole leaves without chewing them and without digesting them. What they do is that they'll grab a leaf from a plant and then fold it really elaborately, put it like in their mouth, and then swallow it whole. And that works like that Velcro effect. So they go through the gut system and take out parasites, and they irritate the gut as well, so that the chimpanzees get diarrhea. But the intriguing thing is, and so Mike Huffman, who is a primatologist at Kyoto University, who did a lot of work on this, he showed me once on Zoom, and he grabbed a leaf from a plant in his office, and he folded it in different ways. And he said there's multiple ways that chimpanzees can do it. And different groups of chimpanzees use different ways. And they've shown in zoos that when you give them particular leaves, there will be one chimpanzee that figures out a way to fold it and swallow it, and the rest will learn it. And so then you have that kind of social learning. And then when they start associating that with disease and feeling better, they will use it again. So there is that kind of cultural learning involved as well.
So someone who's watching, Mark Merlin, wanted to ask,
hey, Mark.
And this is not exactly medicine, but it is kind of medical behavior. Is these recent reports of mice being able to resuscitate each other, having behaviors that allow them to rescue other rodents? Do you think that's part of this phenomenon as well?
I think it's amazing. So, and again, it comes back, my book, I really focused on the use of drugs and compounds, medicines, because there's so much more that we know about it. But what we are seeing now is different forms of what we would call healing and medicine, right? So when we think about human medicine, resuscitation is really important. And so now there's research that show that mice can do this, and they basically bite the tongue of another mouse to open the airways. But recently, there have also been reports of ants amputating the legs of other ants to stop the spread of a fungal infection. There's also cases of ant queens that eat other ants in the colony that are infected to stop the spread of those infections. There is tons of examples of social distancing. I know this is a word that has a lot of bad associations for a lot of us, but a lot of animals do this too. So ants and bees, a lot of mammals do this. When there are diseased individuals, they start spreading out more. So all of these things, there's also suicide in ants. They're infected, they remove themselves from the colony and die in isolation. Kind of really sad story, but it helps the colony. So all of those things that we do in terms of individual health and public health, we find analogies in nature. And so, they fit under a bigger umbrella of medicine. But again, my book was very focused on medication using medicines because there's so much more known about it right now.
So I think this is a good time to ask sort of what our learnings are from this. One of the things, as someone who writes about antibiotics and wrote a book about the misuse of antibiotics in farming, I was fascinated to see you discuss how the things that you're learning about animals in the wild medicating themselves could be applied to the health of pets, and also potentially to the health of animals that are being raised as production animals. So talk about that. Talk about how you expand this knowledge.
Absolutely. And again, it's so fascinating, right? And I think it goes back again to the idea that humans know better, that we are special, that animals aren't as clever. And especially that domesticated animals have lost a lot of their abilities. So when we look at the livestock industry, of course, a big goal is to increase production for the lowest price possible, right? So what we give our animals is this really, a very standard food, that this kind of kibble-like stuff that we give, or food pellets, where we decide, well, this is the nutrition that an average animal needs. And so we make it in bulk. All the animals get the same. And it's all based on nutrition, right? It's not based on medicine. So those feeds do not contain any medicinal substances. And so then our animals get a lot of diseases. So we decide to just throw in tons of antibiotics, not just for that, but also as a growth hormone. And also anthelmintics that kill worms, because the animals don't have access to the things that normally they would use to heal themselves. What is really amazing to me is that the experiments that researchers did at Utah State University over many decades shows that even when you take the individual compounds of those assembled diets and you give those to whether it's goats or sheep or cattle, they actually assemble their own diet. They can incorporate medicine when they need it, but also they end up eating less And so there was an amazing study where they looked at calves, and you give them the components of the diet instead of the assembled diet. They eat less, and therefore they are also more environmentally friendly. They actually emit fewer greenhouse gases. So they're healthier. They produce the same meat for less food, better environment. So it's really amazing. It's one of those things where you say, if we can accept that animals have some knowledge that we don't, let them use it, and we can actually benefit from it.
Are the dogs okay?
Yeah, I think there was someone walking by the house. Sorry, they and when one start barking, the other one goes too.
Fair. I'm really fascinated by what you just said about animals choosing their own diets and how that may be a form of medication. And I think of the people who have moved animal production systems onto pasture, like grass-fed beef, for instance. I know the folks who run White Oak Pastures in South Georgia have said that when they transformed their pastures from being single hybrid grass to letting multiple species of grasses come into their pastures, that it seemed to really change the health and the condition and the productivity of the beef cattle that they're raising. And that is just fascinating, that the cattle would recognize and welcome that biodiversity in their diets and make use of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And sorry, but if you make those paddocks, you make them diverse, and it doesn't even require that many species. You can get a lot of benefits with using 4 or 6 species. It makes them healthier, but it also makes them happier, right? So when you think about welfare, animals get really stressed when they eat the same stuff over and over all day long. And if you think about what we like, variety in our diet, right? We don't want to eat the same. Think about it as a granola that is everything you need, every meal, every day. You would get really depressed, and the same is true for animals. So those choices also help them living a better and happier life.
So to wrap up, I feel like we need to be anthropocentric for a moment. A few minutes ago, I said I wanted to come back to the question of have we ever observed this behavior in animals and applied it to our own lives? And you mentioned that this is present in traditional medical systems. And so let's start there with what has been learned in the past from animals about medicinal substances. And then we'll move on to how humans benefit more broadly.
Well, so it turns out a lot. And so a lot of the medicines we use in Western medicine that we may think of as, really discovered through the pharmaceutical industry using modern technology actually was first discovered by traditional healers. And so, a lot of the things that even over the last few decades, more than 40% of the new drugs that have hit the market come from plants. And a lot of those were discovered by traditional healers first. And then the question is, where do they get their knowledge from? And it turns out a lot of them get their knowledge from animals. So there's examples of healers, say in Tanzania, that have developed treatments of stomach upset by looking at elephants that basically make a kind of tea of a particular leaf. They have looked at porcupines and found medicines to treat bloody diarrhea. But also much closer to home, when we think about a drug that most of us will have used at some point in our life, is aspirin. And so we look at aspirin as a beautiful round white pill, and we buy it in the pharmacy. But where does it come from? It turns out it actually comes from bears. And so bears have been a really important animal for a lot of people living in the northern hemisphere. A lot of shamans actually become bears during their rituals, and this is true as much in Siberia as it is in North America. And part of the reason for that is that bears are very omnivorous. They dig up roots, and they have a lot of knowledge about medicinal substances. And one of the things they do when they come out of hibernation, where they have been still for months and they're really sore and stiff and they have a lot of pain, they go straight for the willow bark of trees and eat that. And that bark contains salicylic acid, which is an anti-inflammatory. And then that was rediscovered later on. And then the pharmaceutical industry made it into aspirin by changing the chemical formula a little bit. But ultimately, it was discovered by bears, and people looking at bears discovered it, passed on the knowledge, and then it was rediscovered, right, by Western science and kind of claimed as this is something we discovered. But it went all the way back to animals.
So will that happen again, or will that happen in the future, do you think? Are animals our first line of drug discovery and development?
Well, that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book. And I wanted to write the book because I want people to realize how amazing animals are. And a lot of people already think that, but it's just yet another thing to say, wow, they're so smart. They know so much. Nature is so full of beautiful things, not just medicines, but also animals that use those medicines and can teach us a lot. So it's kind of also a call to say, well, let's look at animals and actually benefit from them. And there are initiatives. I describe one research in the Democratic Republic of Congo who is specifically tracking bonobos and chimpanzees and gorillas and really looking at them to find out what plants are they using and then building on traditional knowledge to find out are they medicinal. And then what they're doing is they're getting fractions of the chemicals, test them in the lab against bacteria as well as malaria parasites. So I think that sort of thing is starting. And then one really recent example is cats. And you mentioned your cat eating grass, but your cat may also like catnip. And so catnip is a plant that a
I
lot of
grow it
cats
right outside the door.
they
So
go
she doesn't have to
crazy
go
over it,
far.
right?
Yeah.
And but it's only several years ago that researchers in Japan really started digging into it, and they actually looked at silvervine, which is a similar species as catnip, and really makes cats excited. It turns out that through cats by rolling around and licking and rubbing these plants, they coat themselves in a chemical that protects them against mosquitoes and mosquito bites. And the researchers isolated the chemical and they have now patented it to produce a new mosquito repellent for humans. So even today, it's happening. And so I would hope that with more people realizing how much nature has to offer, that more people will specifically look at animals as teachers for us.
So there's a thing that you say toward the end of the book that I particularly want to hear you emphasize, and I think it's a great place to end. And that is that animals can only make or express these discoveries and can only present these lessons for us because those lessons are the product of however many millions of years of evolution. But we are taking away those ecosystems faster than evolution can keep up. And as a result, maybe we're sacrificing those learnings we haven't recognized yet. I'd love to hear you verbalize this a bit more.
Absolutely. When you look at nature and you look at the plants and the fungi out there, it's really a whole natural pharmacy out there, right? And people have realized this for a long time. But when we're degrading that and getting rid of a lot of the species, we're also getting rid of a lot of medicines, potential medicines for us, but also medicines that animals use. And so you see this with traditional healers, right? It's getting harder and harder for them to find some species. They have to travel long distances now for something that would be around much more close to their homes. And so you already see that. And so you see that with animals too, because at the end of the day, the most important thing that allows animals to medicate, have choices in their ecosystems, have the different plants available. And when we think about conservation biology, we often think animals need food, they need shelter, but we rarely think they also need medicine, right? So, and understanding that whole diversity is really important to keep the medicine cabinet going for these animals. But also, when we degrade ecosystems and a lot of species go extinct, it also includes the animals that use that medicine and that can teach us about how to use medicine, right? So I think it's also a call that, and I think the nice thing about it is it's a call to say, let's preserve nature. And, people like me, we want to do that anyway because we love nature and it's beautiful. But you can even put an economic argument on it if you want. It's like, well, there's a gold mine of medicines out there, so let's discover them and let's not get rid of them, because it's this wealth of information that we can use. And it can make some people rich and some people care about that.
I guess that's a good place to stop. Yep. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your book. And thanks to Cooper and Tucky, did I say it right?
Yeah, perfect.
For appearing as well. It sounds like they're calmer again. So,
yes.
So thank you
so
again. And thanks to all of you watching. That's it for this episode of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series. please consider giving some attention to Jaap's work. You can find him on Blue Sky and on Instagram, and also at his personal faculty page at Emory. And we expect you to buy his book, which is available at the Princeton University Press, who's his publisher, and at Amazon, of course. But we like to recommend the anti-Amazon, bookshop.org. It supports local bookstores with your orders. So the end of this evening marks the end of this season of health storytelling. We'll be back in September with a whole fresh slate of authors. You can find out about next season on our listserv. If you registered for tonight's event, you will be added to the mailing list. You can unsubscribe right away if you feel the need. I will not be offended. You can also watch our registration page for announcements. And until we're back, you can watch 5 years of archived interviews on our YouTube page. That's the YouTube channel of the Center for the Study of Human Health. Thanks for joining us this academic year. Until next time, I'm Maryn McKenna. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University and the Georgia Center for the Book and Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement and Ideas Festival and the Atlanta Science Festival, and from me, thank you for watching. See you in the fall.